All right, so we are beginning Unit 6 of Jews, Israel, and Jesus. And Unit 6 is called Covenant. We're going to look at the various covenants between God and man and understand that God is a covenant keeping God. Some covenants are one sided. God guarantees that He's going to do it no matter what. Other covenants have terms where both parties are obligated and there are blessings and curses depending on whether or not the terms of the covenant are met. And we also want to understand the differences between the Old Covenant, God's covenant, which is still in effect for the people of Israel, and the New Covenant, which is the covenant promised to Israel that was fulfilled in Messiah Jesus, and which New Covenant believers and followers of Jesus are under today. By understanding covenant, you understand what God has done, what He guarantees, what the terms and conditions are. This is like reading through an agreement and signing your name on the line, or understanding how God has signed His name on the line to guarantee terms of a covenant. So we're going to get into all the details about God's covenant with Noah, Abraham, Israel, the promise of the new covenant, how Jesus fulfills the new covenant, and really explore and understand the various aspects of these covenants and the covenant, of course, that we are under because of what Jesus has done. So the opening scripture for this unit is Genesis 17:7. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. Hallelujah. And that is God's covenant with Abraham. He says everlasting covenant, to be your God. Well, only the everlasting God can make an everlasting covenant. But that's a promise of, I'm going to be your God for all eternity. This is my covenant. And that's what God said to Abraham. And we're going to look into that in the next few classes. But first, let's start with some basics. What is a covenant? By definition, a covenant is an alliance or a pledge between peoples or parties. So you can think of between men or between governments, even governments that are formed by men or people. It's a treaty, an agreement, or an alliance, or you could call it a league. Like in World War I or II, I think it was called the League of Nations. Now it is called the United Nations, but they are in treaty with one another. They are in an agreement together. You could also call it a confederacy, where common people come together and they say, these are the terms of our agreement together. We're going to be allies. If one of us gets attacked by an enemy, the other one will join in the fight against that enemy. Our enemies are the same enemies. And sometimes that's how people get together. They identify their common enemy and they say, you know what, we'd be better off if we were together. So let's make an agreement between us to understand the terms of how we're going to fight together against this common enemy. Well, those are the types of treaties that would be agreements between people. A covenant might also be cut between a monarch and a subject. And the reason I say a covenant is cut is because the root word for covenant means to cut or to eat. And we'll talk about that in a moment, about how blood covenants were often sealed with blood. So animals were cut. That was the symbol of the covenant that was being drawn up between two people. Now we have terms on contracts and paper. So nowadays we cut a piece of paper, but those days they cut an animal as the symbol of the covenant. So you cut covenant with people. Well, a covenant can also be cut between a monarch and his subjects. That means a king or a governing body with their subjects. That could be like a constitution. These are the terms of our agreement. We're going to rule you, but these are the terms of the agreement. These are the laws. These are the statutes. These are the ordinances. These are the obligations. These are the consequences for disobedience. These are the rewards. These are the benefits. All of these types of things. So monarchs or governments might also have constitutions or covenants between them and their people. Covenants are also cut in Marriage, a marital covenant. It's an alliance between two people, between a husband and a wife of independent mind and body. A husband and wife joined together in the covenant of marriage. They make a vow to one another to be faithful to one another, no matter what life throws at them together, or no matter what life throws at either one of them. They join together and agree that any enemy of either one of them becomes the enemy of them both. It is a covenant of marriage. They are in this together for the rest of their lives. That's what a marriage covenant is supposed to be, at least. These days, in some cultures, marriage covenants are not taken as seriously as they once were. But in the eyes of God, it is a covenant. It is a lifelong alliance between a husband and a wife. Well, a covenant can also be cut between God and man. So God can speak to man and say, I am cutting a covenant with you. And then God gives the terms of the covenant, the divine ordinances, or any signs, or any pledges, or blessings, or curses that go along with the covenant for obedience or disobedience. So covenants are not just between people. God is the one who cut most of the covenants that we're going to talk about in this unit. But we're just going through a basic understanding of what covenants are, because covenants were a very common form of agreement between people in the ancient world. So when God came along and said to Noah or to Abraham, I'm going to cut a covenant with you, it wasn't some obscure term that they had never heard of. Covenants were very common between people in that day. Remember, the ground was cursed and people were just trying to survive. So they were joining alliances with other families, with other tribes, with other nations, so that they could survive in the world. So God came along, and then he also can cut covenant with people. And some of the phrases that you'll hear about covenants are covenant cutting, covenant making, covenant keeping, or a covenant violation. So if you're keeping covenant, it means that you understand the terms of the covenant that you have sealed with somebody else, and you are faithfully keeping the terms of that covenant. You are a covenant keeping person. Our God is a covenant keeping God. That means you made a promise and you're going to keep your promise no matter what. And I mean, no matter what, you're covenant keeping. Or a covenant violation means that the terms of the covenant are clear and you have not kept or held to the terms of that covenant. And therefore, usually that would mean that the curses or the consequences of the covenant could come upon you, rightfully so, because you violated the terms of the covenant. So that's just some basic definitions. Well, covenants, as I mentioned, were often blood covenants. They were sealed with blood. And what that signifies is the lifeblood, meaning your life. Meaning, if you violated the terms of the covenant or you failed to uphold your end of the deal, then you would pay for it by shedding your blood. You would pay for it by giving your life. Now, there are a couple of ways that that can happen. One way, if you're a person of honor and integrity and a covenant-keeping person, then if all sorts of circumstances come against you to make it impossible for you to keep the terms of the covenant that you have cut, then you will give up your own life rather than break the terms of the covenant. That's what a truly covenant-keeping person will do. They will give up their life rather than violate the terms of the covenant. Or if they are not willing to give up their life rather than break the terms of the covenant, if this person violates the terms of the covenant, then the other party in the covenant who has experienced the violation of the other person has the right to kill them. So either you can give up your own life or the other party has the right to kill you. Those are the terms of a blood covenant. Blood covenants, you pay for it with your own blood. But this would be symbolized when the covenant would be cut. Like I said, the root word for covenant means to cut or to eat. So usually when covenant was cut between two parties, an animal would be sacrificed and the animal would be cut in two pieces, meaning like picture a bull and you cut it in half from top to bottom. And then you put the pieces on one side and the other, and the two parties of the covenant would walk between the two halves of the cut animal sacrifice. And And then typically they would eat the sacrifice as a covenant cutting meal. And in other examples, people might cut their own flesh. For example, like cutting the palm of their hands and then shaking hands to mingle their own blood one with another, because this was the sign of the blood covenant between them. And covenants weren't always blood covenants. They usually were, especially for more serious matters. But ancient covenants would also have other terms, benefits, or curses for those who did not hold to the terms of the covenant. And there are some crazy things in ancient covenants, especially the curses that you can find. For example, like, if you do not keep the terms of this covenant, then may your chickens gouge out the eyes of all your flocks and herds. So they would come up with these things and say, okay, you're taking this pledge, you're making this vow, you're cutting this covenant between us. And if you do not hold to the terms of this, if it wasn't a blood covenant that you pay for with your life, then they would call down all kinds of curses upon you. And you could expect that these things would happen in your life if you did not hold to the terms of the covenant. Well, if there was a covenant between God and people, then an animal sacrifice was typically required. And the animal sacrifice usually represented the substitute of the human, that the animal was offered in replacement of the human. The human who violated the terms of the covenant should be giving their life, but instead the animal is offered as a substitute, and the animal sheds their blood and gives their life to preserve the human alive, even though they violated the terms of the covenant. Now, covenants can also be sworn by oaths. So if you take an oath, that is a verbal agreement. And there was a time in this world where an oath, or a man's word, was his bond. That means if he said it, he was going to do it. Now, a bond, like a bond on the stock market, means that you lend someone money and they are obligated to pay you back. Now, that's all done on paper now, so everybody has a written record. But if your word is your bond, then you are guaranteeing whatever it is that has come out of your mouth. So swearing by oath is swearing with your mouth to uphold the terms of the covenant. So it's not just cutting the covenant, but it's adding a sworn oath on top of the covenant. So covenants would be sworn in the name of the highest authority that could be found. So I swear by the name of Almighty God. That's a good one because he is the highest authority around. Or I swear by the name of the king. So in that example, what you're doing is I swear by the name of the king. That gives the king the right to uphold and enforce the terms of the oath and the covenant if you violate the terms. So if it's a blood covenant and you've sworn in the name of the king, then the king has the right to kill you on behalf of the other party. Or you may have also heard people say things, I swear by my children. Well, what they're really saying is, I swear that if I violate the terms of my oath and this promise that is coming out of my mouth, then you have the right to take my children away from me. Or it might even go so far as you have the right to kill my children. So we need to be very careful in swearing oaths. These are not casual things. Just because it's hard to find someone in the world today that actually keeps their word doesn't mean that we should be careless in saying things like, I swear by my children. You don't know what's coming out of your mouth and how serious that actually is, even in the sight of God. Well, a sworn oath in God's name gives God the right to take the life of the person who violates or fails to uphold the terms of the covenant. So you would see this in a court of law where people lay their hand on the Bible and they swear, that's an oath, they're swearing an oath to tell the truth, so help me God. So that means that they're giving God the right to inflict punishment on them if they are not telling the truth. So I hope this is starting to make some sense. Well, covenants can also be one-sided, meaning that only one party is obligated to keep terms and conditions. Or covenants can be two-sided, meaning that both parties that are entering into this agreement are obligated to fulfill and perform or abstain from certain actions. So in a one-sided covenant, one party is obligated to fulfill the terms no matter what circumstances happen, and even if the other covenant partner is not faithful to the terms. It is a one-sided agreement. So essentially, a one-sided covenant, the person is saying, I will be faithful to our covenant, even if you are not faithful to our covenant. They are saying, I will be faithful to our covenant no matter what circumstances may change. Now, an example of this, again, going back to the marriage covenant, the marriage vows often include in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, till death do us part. So that is, no matter what circumstances come, I will be faithful to our covenant. No matter if you are not faithful to the covenant, I will be faithful to our covenant. So you see, even in the traditional marriage vows, these vows include, I will be faithful. It is a one-sided covenant that comes together. Each party swears their side to a covenant that comes together. And each party is obligated to keep the terms of that covenant, whether or not the other party keeps their end of the bargain. Well, a two-sided covenant obligates both parties to one another. Both parties are obligated to fulfill the terms between them. So these terms might be to do certain things or to not do certain things. And the covenant requirements for either party might be the same or they might be different. So a covenant between two parties that is a two-sided covenant might be that I will do ABC and you will do ABC. Or I will do ABC and you will not do ABC. Or I will do ABC and you will do XYZ. So you see, the terms can be different for each party, but the parties are coming together and agreeing upon who is going to do what or not do what, and they're agreeing together about the terms of this two-sided covenant. Both parties are obligated to fulfill the terms of the covenant. Now, the terms, meaning the obligation of each party, we're going to go into a different meaning of the word term, meaning like the length of time. So a covenant might have a term limit, meaning that the terms are only valid until a certain point in time. So a term limit. Or it might be a continuous covenant, or it could be an everlasting covenant. So if the covenant has a term limit, then the terms of the agreement and the obligation to uphold the agreement expires after a certain agreed upon length of time or upon a certain event that was anticipated. So after 10 years, our covenant is over and neither party is obligated anymore. Or upon so-and-so turning 25 years old, the terms of the covenant expire, etc., etc. Or if such and such event happens, then the terms of the covenant are null and void. Well, some covenants extend forever, and that passes on from generation to generation. So, for example, treaties between nations. It goes from one president to the next. It remains between the nations no matter who the ruler is, unless the ruler changes the terms of the agreement. Or again, the marital covenant is until death do us part. I guess that's actually a term limit. It's an event that says with this event, the terms of the covenant are over, okay? But some covenants are forever. But the only one who's able to cut an everlasting covenant is God, because God is the only one who is able to uphold the promise to have an everlasting promise and to fulfill an everlasting promise. So God is able to cut everlasting covenant. And we will see examples of times when he does that, but not every covenant that God cuts is everlasting, and we'll learn about that too. But first, let's look at some examples from the scriptures, because covenants are a serious business. These were alliances between peoples for survival in the world. So let's look at some examples from the early history of Israel. We'll start with Genesis 26. This is when Abimelech, the king of Gerar, cut a covenant with Isaac. Now, Isaac was a sojourner in his land. He had no reason to cut a covenant with Isaac. As the king of the area, he probably should have wanted to just dominate Isaac and make Isaac pay him tribute. However, he recognized that the blessing of the Lord was with Isaac, and therefore he wanted to cut a covenant with Isaac. He wanted to be allied with Isaac. He said, please don't hurt me, and we won't hurt you. And then a covenant also presumes that if we have an enemy, then that enemy is your enemy. hey, if we get attacked by our enemies, then we are in covenant with you and you will help us. So this king, Abimelech, he was pretty smart. He said, I see the blessing of God on that guy. I want to be aligned with that guy, because if I'm aligned with him, then the blessing of God will be aligned with me, because the blessing of God is with him. So this is, again, one of the examples where we see that God is already at work in drawing the nations unto himself. This was when Isaac was the only person in the whole world who had a relationship with the one true God, the God of Israel. So let's take a look. Genesis 26, starting with verse 26. When Abimelech went to him from Gerar with Ahuzath his advisor and Pekol the commander of his army, Isaac said to them, Why have you come to me, seeing that you hate me and have sent me far away from you? They said, We see plainly that the Lord has been with you. So we said, Let there be a sworn pact between us, between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you, so that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you, and have done to you nothing but good, and have sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of the Lord. So he made them a feast, and they ate and drank. So making the feast, that is the covenant-cutting meal. They most likely offered a sacrifice, walked through the pieces of the sacrifice, and enjoyed a covenant meal together to enter into covenant together with one another. So you see, we see that the blessing of the Lord is upon you, and so we want to be in covenant with you so that you won't harm us. He's entering into an agreement to be allied together. Well, another example of this is from the book of Joshua. This is when Joshua and the elders of Israel failed to ask the Lord about whether or not they should cut a covenant with the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites pretended to come from a faraway land, but instead they were actually inhabitants of the land that God was giving to Israel by dispossessing the nations that were there. And the command of the Lord was to dispossess and leave nothing alive that breathes in all the nations that were in the land. But the Gibeonites came and deceived the people of Israel, and the people of Israel cut a covenant with them. So this was serious, and they had to take this seriously, and they could not destroy the Gibeonites because they had sworn a covenant with them. This is Joshua 9, starting with verse 6. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal, and said to him and to the men of Israel, We have come from a distant country, so now make a covenant with us. So the Gibeonites have come, and they're all dressed up, and they're putting on this show that they've come from a distant country, and they're saying, Make a covenant with us. We're going to jump to verse 14. So the men took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live. And the leaders of the congregation swore to them. So that's the covenant and the oath. We're at verse 16. At the end of 3 days after they had made a covenant with them, so 3 days, they probably had a 3-day party, a 3-day feast to cut this covenant with them. They heard that they were their neighbors and that they lived among them. And the people of Israel set out and reached their cities on the 3rd day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Chephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. But the people of Israel did not attack them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Then all the congregation murmured against the leaders. So these cities that Israel should have conquered and destroyed because God was giving them the promised land, they did not conquer and destroy because they had made a covenant and they had sworn it in the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. So they swore in God's name, meaning that they gave God the right to destroy them if they violated the terms of the covenant, and meaning that God's name was on the line. If the Israelites violated the terms of this covenant in the name of God, then they're violating God's name in the earth to the Gibeonites. They're bringing shame and blaspheming God's name by violating the terms of the covenant that they cut in God's name. Well, God takes covenant so seriously, and he takes oaths that are taken in his name so seriously that hundreds of years later, God sent a plague upon Israel as his punishment punishment for Israel's violation of their covenant with the Gibeonites, which had been in the days of Joshua. So during the days of King Saul, the Israelites had killed some Gibeonite men, which in their covenant they had agreed not to do. Well, the plague didn't come until the days of David. And so David inquired of the Lord, what is this plague? Why is this happening? And the Lord said, there is blood guilt on the house of Saul because he put the Gibeonites to death. That's 2 Samuel 21, verse 1. You can see that there in your study guide. So covenant is a serious business. God takes covenant very seriously, especially covenants that are cut in his name. So I hope that gives you a basic understanding of what covenants are and some of the variable factors of covenants, because all of these things about the definition of covenants are going to be significant as we start to dig into the covenants that God cuts between himself and his people. All right, so we're going to move into point B of Unit 6, which is Noah and all creation. God cut a covenant with Noah and with all creation. It's one covenant, but it's with Noah and all creation. And it is a one-sided, everlasting covenant. So we learned about what that means. It is not two-sided. There are not two parties that are obligated. God is the only one obligated. And because God is the one on the hook, he also clarifies that this is an everlasting covenant. This is a promise that he will keep for eternity. All right, so let's give you some of the background. This is after the flood. So God had told Noah to build an ark so that he and his family and a remnant of creation, the animals on the ark, would be preserved through the flood, through the waters of the flood. And then the waters of the flood receded, the ark landed, and Noah eventually and his family and the animals, they all came out of the ark. And when they came out, Noah offered a sacrifice unto the Lord. And the fragrance of the sacrifice lifted up, the smoke of the sacrifice lifted up into the nostrils of God, and it was a pleasing aroma to him. And at that point, God saw the intercession, saw the sacrifice of Noah, and he said, I will never again flood the earth. I will never again curse the ground because of humans. And he says, because I see that the intent of the human heart is wicked all the time. Now, this seems like a contradiction. Because the human heart is wicked all the time, you would think that God would reserve the right to destroy all of creation again by the flood. No, but because Noah has offered a sacrifice and it is a pleasing aroma in the nostrils of God, he says, no, because I see that mankind, they are just wicked to the core and their hearts are evil all the time. I will not destroy and curse all the earth again just because of the sins of man, because they can't help themselves. This would just be one flood after the next, after the next. My creation would be cursed and cursed and cursed. So I am not going to curse them again because Noah has made this sacrifice and done this act of intercession. So God calls Noah to himself and he says, I'm going to cut a covenant with you. This is going to be my covenant with you and your offspring and all creation. So we're looking at Genesis chapter 9, starting with verse 8. And this is the first time in the Bible that the word covenant is used. So Genesis 9, starting with verse 8. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, behold, I will establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. I will establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. So God is not going to judge by a worldwide global flood ever again. We know that there is a day of judgment coming, and that will not be by water, but it will be by fire. But God says, I promise, I am making a covenant. This is my covenant. I promise that I will never again destroy all of creation with a flood to destroy the earth. We're up to verse 12. And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth." So the bow, now we just kind of, if you're familiar with your Bible and you hear, "I have set my bow in the cloud," and some translations, I think, even call it the rainbow. Well, you think immediately of the rainbow in the sky, and that is the sign of the covenant. The rainbow in the sky. Yes, that is the sign. That is the evidence. So when it rains and then a rainbow appears in the sky, that is God affirming his covenant that, yep, it's raining right now, but I'm not going to have it rain so much that the whole earth is going to be flooded. So even if you're experiencing a flood in your part of the world, if the rainbow appears in the sky, God is affirming his covenant. This might be just in this area, but I'm not flooding the whole world because I made an everlasting covenant with Noah and all creation. This is the sign of my covenant. I'm not going to flood the whole earth ever again. Well, but the word for bow is not actually the word for rainbow. The word for bow in every other instance of Scripture is used to describe the weapon of war, like an archer, in archery. An archer has a bow and arrows. So God is setting his bow up in the clouds. He is not going to destroy. He's not going to shoot his arrows at all creation anymore by sending a flood over the earth. God does not want to be the enemy of mankind. He sets up his weapon of war in the clouds. He's putting it away. He's laying it aside. I am setting my bow in the sky. It will be the sign of the covenant between me and all the earth that I'm not going to destroy all creation by a flood ever again. We're at verse 14. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. So God, when he sees the rainbow, even if a flood is coming on a certain part of the world, which can and may be an act of God's judgment, God is remembering that he will not flood the whole earth or destroy the whole earth by a flood ever again. He sees the bow and he remembers that he put his weapon of war up, and he is no longer shooting his bow and his arrows at all of mankind by sending a flood. So it's the sign. And right there, you also saw it is an everlasting covenant. God establishes it. He's the only one able to establish an everlasting covenant because he's the only eternal one who can uphold terms of an everlasting covenant. So this is for eternity. The world will never, for all eternity, ever be flooded again to destroy all of creation. We're at verse 17, finishing this up. God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." So underneath this, we've talked about some of these points already, but in this unit, I've gone through, and whenever there's a covenant being cut, I've put points underneath it so that it makes it very clear, this is in your study guide, of the elements of the covenant and parts of the definition of covenant that we just covered of how this covenant matches up. So first of all, the covenant is with every living creature in the earth. It's between God and every living creature on the earth. The covenant is forever, for all future generations. It's an everlasting covenant. The promise of the covenant is that there will never again be a flood to cut off all life and destroy the earth. The sign of the covenant is the rainbow in the clouds. God's bow is in the clouds, and the covenant is one-sided. God said it this way: I will establish, I make the covenant, I will do this, I have established. So it's one-sided. It doesn't say, I will do this and you will do that. It just says, I will, I will, I will, I will. It is one-sided. It is everlasting. God has made his first covenant promise to Noah and all creation that he will never again flood all the earth to destroy it.